Okay, hello. Hey, we are back here. We are on Founders Live, and today we are joined by Josh Murr. And Josh, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here today.
Great, thank you. Finally, we're able to sit down and have a conversation. Josh is a Seattle investor as well as an author, and we're going to talk about both of those things today. But Josh, really would appreciate if you could maybe just give a little bit of background on yourself. What is Seattle Angel? Talk about a few of your books. Just let us know who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm Josh. I've been in the Seattle tech community since the dot-com days. Back in those days, I joined a startup and watched it, implode or watch it start the process of imploding. And, was always kind of fascinated, really from that point on what, after that startup, like what made these, companies really grow. And, I was a young guy. I was in my early 20s at the time. Uh, and watching this company implode and kind of watching all of these companies that were being created at that time implode, it was a fascinating thing from a how could you miss allocate capital perspective. So fast forward 10 years, eventually accumulated enough wealth of my own through kind of starting some things, investing in some things, and immediately put it to work, investing in early stage companies. I had started a thing called Seattle Lunch 2.0 back in 2001. And so that was kind of, 2005, not 2001. So that was really the first kind of start of lots of new events in the Seattle tech space post, since the 2001 timeframe. Now there's lots of great activity that's happening. But when I had started that, I was meeting all these really interesting entrepreneurs, really interesting companies that were happening, that were being built here in Seattle. So really focusing on how do I invest in these great companies. I can see that they're not misallocating their capital. It was really exciting to me, and still continues to be something that makes me excited to get up every day.
Yeah, and I think that comes to my next question is, why did you choose to be an investor, maybe versus being a founder? A lot of people are starting companies here in Seattle. What drove you to more of the investment side?
I've always been closer to the investment side than the operational side. Since at a young age, I always had an interest in investing in other people who were excelling and being able to analyze what works and what doesn't work from afar was a much better skill than being able to analyze what works in the moment for me. And so I took the skills that I have and kind of looked at the board, and there are lots of people who are much better at being entrepreneurs than I am. And so I would rather spend my time, picking those folks instead of trying to craft, change the skill set that I have to, beat those folks at their game. Why not just use the skills that I already have and back the folks who are going to be the winners?
Yeah, and what do you find is most exciting about, especially early stage? You're typically an early stage investor, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the earliest stages, there's so much innovation that can occur, and the real magic that you see at the earliest of stages is, is there enough value, and are people, connecting with that value? Is that value obvious to people? And when you really get that magic, especially when there's something that's incredibly innovative, right? You have a new technology that's never been built before, a new business model that's never been tried before, and to see that connect with an audience in a powerful and meaningful way it's so rewarding. It's unmatched by anything else out there, really.
Yeah, it is, and it's equally when you're in the driver's seat as the founder. That's fun too. But what's the difference is, to say it bluntly, it's possibly less painful from the investor's point of view when things don't go right. You're kind of sitting there, you're watching, you're maybe helping, but it's not your livelihood and your baby. So that might be a plus, but it is it's second to none to see something really take hold. And could you maybe sum up or pick a few ideas or thoughts that you see what works and when it's working and a company is taking hold and traction versus companies that don't?
Yeah, it's tough because it ends up being a little bit different for different companies or the different types of companies and different types of business models. The Plus it's a little bit different with different stages, but the things you start to see, kind of with all companies is, a customer base that's growing in excitement for the product that's being offered. And so it's really easy, I think, for an entrepreneur to start connecting with companies or customers and sell their product to those customers, and those customers might be willing to buy it, and it might be solving a problem for them, but they still may not be, overwhelmingly excited by what they're getting in return for buying this product or buying this service. It tends to be the difference, in the companies who are able to scale, to take that small start and grow at a rapid pace, from the companies who take that small start and don't scale. And so seeing those two things, you see, companies with customers who are, happy to pay, but they're not just overwhelmingly excited about the product that they're getting or the value that they're getting or the people that they're interacting with, versus the companies who are able to, produce those kinds of, emotions from their customers. One, you get, kind of on the consumer side, you get more virality out of those kinds of things, but also just on the customer satisfaction side and the ability to upsell and the ability to reduce churn, and the ability to explore new value add components, all present in the case where the customer is really excited about the product or the company or the people. And it's just not the case in those in situations where the customers aren't that excited. And so regardless of the stage, really focusing on who is the buyer here and how excited are they about what's happening, and is it a growing number of customers? Is it a growing amount of excitement? Even if it's 1 to 10 customers, or 10 to 100, or 100 to 1,000,
right?
Kind of anywhere in that spectrum, you have to have this growing excitement about what the company's doing.
Yeah, look, there is no magic, or maybe there is. No one knows what it is, but it's hard to pin it down. But I think you're absolutely right. But let's wrap in. So you wrote Startup Wealth. When did you publish that?
Yeah. So I wrote this book, Startup Wealth. I published it in October 2005, and so I had spent pretty much all of 2014. So starting January 2014, all the way through the end of the year, and I did a couple of interviews into 2015. But I interviewed over 50 of the top angel investors all over the world, both here in the U.S. as well as abroad. And what I was really looking for is, what makes an angel investor successful? I started Seattle Angel here in town, and our goal at Seattle Angel is to, make the capital raising process more transparent for investors as well as for entrepreneurs. And as I was working with new investors, we've trained over 200 so far out of our programs, I kept finding that investors had different preferences. Some would prefer to be, bet hard on, really risky ideas with, no proof, no evidence that they have yet, and they're, betting mostly on just the person or the personality even. And others would, get all this data and collect all these things to try to figure out what they, what they thought the company was going to do in the future. I started to wonder where on this broad spectrum of investors, what works? What should I be encouraging as someone who's helping new investors get into the game, and what should I be discouraging as someone who's helping new investors get into the game?
Right.
And after interviewing all these people, I quickly found that there was, a pretty regimented spectrum. There are pretty, defined archetypes of different investors, and so included them all in the book in kind of a Coders at Work style of a book. So there's interviews with the different types of investors that are out there. And so if you're an investor or an entrepreneur, you can kind of get access to these folks who invested in Google, early angel investors in Google or PayPal or Eventbrite or Invisalign or you name it. It's just kind of all over the board. Really some of the top companies, the early stage investors, those angel investors, were interviewed for the book. So, what their opinion is, how they go about finding companies, how they negotiate those deals, what they add value with, and kind of how they see those investments from a post-investment perspective as well as the pre-investment perspective.
Yeah, and you did a great job. I really enjoyed reading it. I actually read it. I read it over Christmas last year, which was really cool. And I found it was very valuable for me as a founder and entrepreneur, just from it gives you a way deeper perspective and understanding what's going on in their head and how early stage investors perceive deals, how they go about it, how what they look for, and because these are things that even if you're a well-seasoned entrepreneur, it's still hard to understand, or like it's that gray area that is just a big question mark of what goes in the mind of an investor. What are they thinking? What are they looking for at that point in time? And I felt like the book. What's really interesting is the book presents these various perspectives and basically personalities. And some people they are aggressive, and some people are very risk averse. And it was really interesting. I really appreciated it, just from you are making it more transparent, for us as well as other investors. That basically you wrote it for, like, hey, if you're looking to get in angel investing, here's from the top, how many, 40? Like,
Well, I interviewed 50. There's about 21 that are in the book.
okay, yeah, so just a wide spectrum, and it was very educational. And so I think what, what did you take, how did it make you a better investor?
Yeah, it's interesting because I wrote the book, with the goal of, really making these other investors' approach to investing more transparent. There's a lot of books that are written by people who would maybe go interview all of those people and then write about what they learned. And that's not within this book, actually. Within this book is really, how these people go about investing. And I try to keep my mitts off of what they, kind of told me, or what really giving everyone that raw experience. And so the things that I learned in the process I'm kind of in the process of figuring out how to really put that into, other materials. So far, I've been doing a lot of, speaking at different events, talking about the things that I learned in the process. But there are definitely some key attributes. There's some key things that all investors look for in the team. So out of all of the investors that I interviewed, there's some similarities. Most investors couldn't come out right and say, hey, these are the 4 things that I look for, and have 15 other investors agree. And I spent a lot of time kind of questioning why and why they were using the words that they were using. So the team is one area that I've changed my approach by learning that. The other things that I learned were, just really focusing on understanding what value I bring to the table and what value I don't bring to the table, and making sure that I have the right other folks, on my list of, people who I'm inviting into a deal, or people who I'm trying to get to invite me into a deal, who, complement the things that I bring to the table. It's really, kind of a key thing. You look at the best investors and they all do this. And then, kind of the third, really, focusing more on that reflection component. I met quite a number of investors who have a really strong reflection on their process. And then I met a lot of investors who were successful and they didn't have this reflection process built into their investment. And the folks who didn't have as strong or as rigorous of a reflection process, they tended to, not be able to call out what it was that was meaningful when they made an investment, like why it was successful or why it wasn't successful. So those are the 3 areas that, really changed my thinking and my approach. And then just generally speaking, I really realized that there's a handful of things that all investors kind of need to understand that are, what's risky about a company. And out of that handful of things, there may be 10 different ways to understand what that risk is. What the team risk is, or the market risk is, or the product risk is. And just understanding that all the investors are looking to understand the same risks, but they're doing it in different ways. And that's an okay thing. But that was just kind of a general thing that I learned in the process.
Yeah. let's review. If you do, you have those on the top of your head? What would be those initial handful of risks?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, from the risk perspective, they're kind of this, is it a does the business model work? Does the unit economics, work, and can it grow at scale? Is the market size big enough? And then, the team itself, is the team the right team to be doing, this particular, business, both from a technical perspective, are they the right experts in the space, or are they bringing the right experts into the space? And then also from the business model perspective, are they the right entrepreneurs for that business model in that market? Can they sell to that customer? Those kinds of things. And then just from the product itself, the innovation itself, is it truly adding value? Is it truly differentiated? Does it have something that no one else is really providing to those customers? And then from the distribution, what's the mechanism to get that product out there, out to market? Is it just online? Is it on iTunes, or is it a brick and mortar distribution network that needs to be out there? And are the entrepreneurs capable of dealing with that that distribution network? And then the other component is really the financing risk. What does the capital raise structure look like? As an investor, you're involved in one round of financing, at least initially, right? So when a company and investor meet and they have the conversation, it's a conversation about capital for this one round of financing. And almost in all cases, one round of financing, or the first round of financing, means that there's going to be another round of financing. And so there's a risk to the company just by taking financing that you're not going to get just to be at scale to raise that next round of financing. And it's only a new risk that comes in when you raise capital. And so it's kind of, it's also one of the things that a lot of investors look at.
Well, yeah, right there is really interesting that, just acknowledging that, it's the first round, or that early round, there probably is going to be another one. And so, having capital that is allocated for just the follow-on, just to retain that certain percentage ownership, that's just, a risk in itself. But what have you noticed that, maybe less experienced investors, or maybe earlier in their career, mistakes that they might make?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I see is investors investing too much money before they really kind of know what they want to be investing in, or the portfolio that they want to build. And so it's really easy to do, right? You start investing, and you meet a really interesting company, a brilliant entrepreneur, and they ask for a $50,000 or $100,000 minimum for the first investment, and you're like, yeah, okay. And if you make a couple of investments in that way, it's pretty easy to have half or all of your early stage allocation invested before you have even realized what kinds of companies you're good at analyzing, what kinds of business models you understand best, how much of your portfolio do you really want to put out every year, or every couple of years, whatever it happens to be, to really formulate your thesis for that part of it. And so that's the easiest mistake that investors make. And oftentimes, when they've already allocated all of their capital, or most of their capital, they realize, hey, this is the kind of deal that I'm better at. I really like looking at B2B SaaS businesses, or I really like looking at health food, organic foods, or I really like looking at physical goods that are being Kickstarter projects, conversions into real companies, whatever it happens to be. And not having the capital to invest in the thing that, once you realize that it's there, is just a really tough position to be in as an investor. So, obviously the advice is to slow down and really start, thinking about the advice, or the types of companies and the amount of companies that you want to have in your portfolio.
It has to be just an education in itself, right? The process, and clearly the first 5 or 10 that someone invests in, that's probably more of a learning experience, and not to say that those won't turn out well, but there's just a process, I would assume, that just teaches each individual as they go along, oh shoot, that's what I need to do, or those sort of things. But what I would like to do is transition to actually kind of bring in your second book. And what was that book? And it's still in the investment industry, but it's a slightly different angle.
Yeah, absolutely. So after the first book, I wrote this second book called Investing in Pre-IPO Stock, or How to Make Money Investing in Pre-IPO Stock. So the book came about, actually I wrote it with this guy Manny Fernandez here. He's actually just appeared on How to Make Me a Millionaire Inventor on CNBC just a couple weeks ago. They're opening the season. And the premise of the book is really about investing in companies before they IPO. So really at the last stage of investing. And so typically angel investors look at the earliest stages because the dollar amounts are what they can afford. It's tough for an angel investor to put their first money in at a Series C round, right? It's really expensive to buy into a company at that stage. And really the next place that most investors traditionally had been looking is post-IPO or during the IPO process. And so what Man was really looking at, and what we looked at kind of the data around, was what happens with the folks who are buying these secondary shares just before the IPO. And so that's really what the whole book's about. Like, how would you go about buying these secondary shares? What would a portfolio look like if you were going to have one that included these secondary shares? And when buying those secondary shares, you're really interested in buying a company that's going to IPO in the next 2 to 4 years. And the return is going to be less. It's not going to be a 30x return or a 100x return or something like that. But it's going to be more of a 2 to 4x multiple, which is still pretty good for 2 to 4 years. So it's more of a smaller kind of a how-to book focused on that pre-IPO market. And it's one that's been growing. The laws have kind of changed to make it easier for both founders and early employees to sell their shares on the secondary market. Somewhat in recognition of the slow IPO market, there was a highway bill that made it easier actually for founders and employees to sell their stock earlier.
Yeah, and how do you feel about that? Like, do you think it? Yeah. Yeah. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's both good and bad, right? You look at the case we analyzed in this one is Twitter. They were a very large amount of shares that they sold from founders, early investors, and early employees. They did a $800 million round before their IPO, and $400 million of that was existing shareholders selling their shares to new investors, which is a huge number, right? I mean, it's half of the round that they did was early investors or early employees getting out of the deal. For the folks who are in the company, getting that early liquidity, certainly makes it easier or more palpable to continue working for a company that's not exiting, that's not IPOing in any way. You can college fund, you can buy the house that you've been putting off buying, all of those kinds of things. So if it's in a situation where the folks who are selling those early shares are doing it for their benefit, then I think that's a good thing. I think for early stage investors, there's probably actually more room for early stage investors to think about selling early, selling their shares early. This Twitter one, Union Square Ventures, they were one of the first venture funds to invest in Twitter, and they sold a huge stake of their first dollars in. They kept lots, and they kept their later investments, but from their first investment, they took a little bit off the table during that financing before their IPO. And so it's important for both, to be beneficial to the founders, but I think it's also something that early stage investors, those early funds or angels, can leverage too.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I haven't been there yet, but if you're sitting on the thing with like paper wealth versus real, that could be really scary if it gets too out of whack. And secondly, let's think about a founder that maybe a team that has been working on, for instance, Twitter, right? Like that was maybe 6-8 years between the founding and the IPO, might have been longer. And you just think about that. There's so much capital and so much value locked up. And if there is a buyer for those shares and it doesn't affect the operations and the own on a general scale, like the board and the ownership and the operations of that company, I don't think it's a problem. And I do feel that if you are a founder and you have a significant stake in a company, you should be able to cash out at least a little bit. Maybe it's, you look at like a percentage of that individual's ownership. Maybe it's up to a certain percentage, so it doesn't get too out of whack and we start experiencing some negative issues. But yeah, I think it makes sense, and I don't think founders should be looked upon negatively if they do that. I think that the questionable activity is, you probably heard the story of, I think it was Secret, do you know that story?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of folks who have gotten down a similar path.
I think it was Secret or Whisper, one of those two that were those anonymous apps, and the founders for some reason, the investors allowed them to do this, but they raised a huge round. It was like a Series A or B, and they took off like millions of dollars, and they're buying Ferraris and Lamborghinis and shit like that. And I think that there's some questionable activity in that realm. But when you look at later in the life of a company, and you have a certain amount of equity tied up in early stage investors and founders, it's okay. I think it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely buyer beware.
You're right. Well, so what's interesting is, what was the rule that changed in the law to allow this, and how do you see that continue moving forward?
Yeah, so in the highway bill, that basically there was a problem for founders to sell their shares. This was the biggest part of the rule. And so for a founder to sell their shares in a secondary transaction, put the founder in a weird position, because like the Secret or Whisper guys, or the other folks who've kind of gone down this path, they could technically issue shares to themselves, and not register the issuing of shares, and then go sell them in a private transaction without ever registering them with anyone. And that was kind of a problem, because then technically just these people could issue themselves endless amounts of shares and sell them to other people, raising money either for themselves or for the company. Doesn't really matter where they put the money, but they're still selling these shares in they're effectively doing a stock offering, but not doing it in a way that is ever registered or met by the SEC. So that was against the law. So the rules said you couldn't do that. You couldn't just issue yourself shares and then go sell them. So for a founder who got founder shares when they started the company, it was in this really weird gray area where they did really just issue themselves shares. Can they not sell them in a secondary transaction, even though like an employee could, because the employee didn't have this right to issue themselves the shares. So the rule really just says, look, why don't you just make the investor worry about it? So the investor needs to worry about all of making sure all the rules are followed. So if it's a secondary transaction, it has to be registered. They have to be shares that weren't issued for the purpose of being sold as a way to raise money, being unregistered. And the same is true for if you're buying shares from not a founder as an investor. The investor, all the responsibility is now just on the investor, and the company or the person issuing shares doesn't have to check if the investor is an accredited investor, or really kind of do any of that diligence. The investor has the right to say, hey, give me access to the books, and that makes that a little bit easier if the founders are willing to do so. So the one part being the founders being able to sell their shares, and then the second part being that employees are able to sell their shares after a month after exercising the shares, and previously it was 12 months. So if you started at a company and you were issued a pile of shares, you'd have to wait 12 months before you could start looking at selling those things. If it happened to be in something where the value went up a lot, or you had a sudden need, or that was a significant portion of your compensation, if you were paid under market, you may want to sell some of those shares. And so this just makes it a little easier for the employees as well to sell the shares after they've exercised them.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a good move. Clearly, just adjusting the law and making sure that the framework is there. I think this is a movement in the right direction. How does crowdfunding come into this? And on maybe a broader stroke here, how do you see crowdfunding changing the landscape of early stage investing?
Yeah, crowdfunding is interesting. It continues to be more interesting in the private space than it is in the public space, although the public space is emerging. There's a few things that are happening. One part of things that are happening are you look at kind of the AngelList platform and the folks who are trying to invest more similarly to AngelList, and the crowdfunding is removing some of the public and looking more at having curated deals with institutional investors or large pools of individual investors, family offices, those kinds of things. And so the aspect of crowdfunding is really starting to focus more on how do we make a diverse investment vehicle for someone who doesn't want to go to an angel group every month, or someone who doesn't want to be active in any way, kind of a thing. And so that's a good thing, because it's opening up this as an asset class to more investors, more funds, more family offices. The other half, really being the public. Most of these private entities, like AngelList, for example, they're moving away from the, having individuals, look at doing deals. And the folks who are looking at the public space are taking in that part of the problem, or that part of the equation. So the folks who are looking more at the public investor, so the Jobs Act compliant type of platforms, are looking more at how do we get the public to access this more? How do we get individuals to allocate $100 a month to 1,000 different companies? Those sorts of dynamics. And so it's interesting just because the crowdfunding platforms are kind of splitting and saying, hey, we're going to focus on crowdfunding on institutional type of investments, and we're going to focus this other type of investing on the public retail type of investment. But both are trying to get at this goal of saying, here's startups as an asset class, and I'm going to give you a diverse investment vehicle that you can kind of add into your overall portfolio, just kind of in two different ways. And I think they're both going to grow. I mean, I think it's going to continue to be a huge part of how companies get funded in the future.
Yeah, the thing with crowdfunding and just the general dream of, oh man, as a founder, if I could just put this out there, and not just like a Kickstarter kind of thing, but I could put this out on a platform and I could raise money from 1,000 or 10,000 different people. That doesn't really excite me, because it seems to be quite complex and like creates a lot of issues that might not be enjoyable to deal with, unless there becomes so I don't want to deal with 10,000 emails, or people just having the ability to reach out. Oh, I'm an investor, I want such and such information. But clearly there will be some frameworks around that as well, in terms of the limits of who can, how much contact they actually do have with the company and whatnot. But what problems do you see, if it is I'm able to raise $100 from 10,000 people? There's going to be some issues. How do you see those issues kind of getting worked out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's up to the platform to try to make some of that easier, or alleviate a little bit of those problems. The flip side to that question is there's a company called Equity Eats, and they are crowdfunding for restaurants basically. And really the premise, or the context of the reason the whole thing works, is because the people who are funding the restaurant, they become owners of the restaurant, and they get, special privileges at the restaurant, discounted food, VIP reservations, special events, all that kind of stuff. And they can, gift those things to their friends. Hey, when you're in town, go to my restaurant. There'll be a table waiting.
That's what you say.
So it's a cool deal, but the way the platform structured it, they've structured it around, this is a equity crowdfunding plus loyalty program. And so they really are encouraging all of these investors to be involved in the process, but then limiting it to, hey, you're only going to be involved in these ways. We're going to give you a mechanism for feedback. We're going to give you a mechanism for input or directions for improvement or something, but it's not going to be 100 or 1,000 of you emailing the founders. It's going to be through a kind of a process that makes it easier for everyone involved. And so I think that kind of thinking about the problem, how do we turn that into an advantage? The platforms that land that are going to make it a lot easier for entrepreneurs, because you're right, the entrepreneurs aren't going to go there. That once you hear one other person who's been through the process and they're like, oh, this was terrible, I had all these emails and everyone was harassing me, no one's going to go there for the second raise, right?
Right. So, yeah, I think what you're suggesting is there is other reasons why a company would actually use the crowd to fund their operations or investment. Basically, it's creating 10,000 invested ambassadors, and there's almost loyalty to it, depending on the company and the product or service. It's similar. You look at what Kickstarter or Indiegogo is doing. It is that initial launch, getting a certain customer group together that then can be advocates for getting new customers and users. And I think that is a unique way to not only fund your company but also get your initial user group. It'll just be interesting to see how from the law that you are talking about to then the crowdfunding and that new legislation, how that is going to change the early stage, not only investment but entrepreneurial activity as this thing goes forward. But before we go, I do want to ask a few questions on, you've heard of a lot of pitches in your day. How would you sum up, what's a good pitch when someone's pitching an investor?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about kind of these different types of investors that are out there, and some are more focused on kind of the problem space or the entrepreneur or whatever, and some are more focused on the data. And for an entrepreneur to have a really good pitch, you have to be able to kind of answer the question from both of those sides of the spectrum, right? Because there's investors that are really extreme on both of the sides of the spectrum, and a lot of folks are in between. And so the thing that's common across both of those sides of the spectrum, so would be applied to almost all investors, is landing the story really well. So really landing, who the customer is, where their problems really are, and how this thing is adding so much more value that they would be, kidding themselves if they weren't willing to shell out cash for it. And that's part of the story. You are going to connect with people who already have seen that in the world. Maybe they've been looking for your solution to the problem, or they see the future and they say, I wish someone's going to build this thing. And when you pitch to them, landing that story, for them to say, yeah, that's the thing that I've been waiting for these people to build, or these entrepreneurs to build. For the folks who are, maybe they don't have a vision of that future, they haven't been waiting for a product in that space to be created yet. That story is the start, right? It draws them into, hey, maybe this is a possibility. Maybe this could be a reality. Maybe people really do want to buy this thing. And so you have kind of these two people who are both drawn into this really compelling vision, or this compelling story of, hey, there's real value that you're creating here, and the rest of the details, right? So can you execute all of that at scale? Are you the right people to grow that idea? Is the product something that you're going to be able to attract the talent to continue to innovate on that product? And then for those folks who are more on the data-driven side, what are the assumptions that you're making about the market and the experiments you're going to run to sell your product into that market, and what that means from a unit economics perspective? The folks who are on the visionary side, who they already see this thing as being something that's going to be huge. They've been waiting for you to come along and build it. They may not care as much about the metrics or the data side, and you may pick that up in your pitch as you're getting questions or reading body language, that kind of thing. But the folks who are really focused on the data, they really have to get that last piece. They have to really understand what are those assumptions, because they're looking at this from the perspective of, prove to me that you've done your homework, prove to me that there really is a market here. I get the vision and the value, but I don't know the market well enough, or I haven't imagined the future that you imagined yet. So just give me some evidence that it's there, that it exists. So you have to cover that spectrum, really from that vision and then all the way down to that data and those assumptions about why this thing is, meaningful, or why now is the time for it to be put out there.
Yeah, and so these very early stage angel investors, they sometimes might be investing before there's a product launch or traction. But what sort of metrics are important when founders are looking to raise money at the earliest stages? When we're talking about traction or a product that's on market, what should be some key milestones that founders need to reach?
Yeah. So you kind of that pre-customer stage. If no one's paying you for the product quite yet, it doesn't mean that you're not able to go raise capital. It makes it a lot harder because it's a lot easier to build product these days. Things that investors are asking themselves are, what are the risks, and how are all these risks going to be mitigated? And so when you walk into give a pitch with a product that maybe hasn't been totally built, or customers haven't started paying you for it, it's really bringing the investor into the conversation about how you're going to go about doing those things, right? How many customers or potential customers have you talked to? And what things have you learned? And what things have you changed in your product or approach based on those conversations? And how does that get you to offering something that's going to convert these folks into paying customers? And that process, that's a really hard process. Some entrepreneurs are able to hit it right away, in the first couple of months. But you know what? Many entrepreneurs, lots of entrepreneurs, it takes a lot longer than a couple of months to get there. And it's not because the product's too complex or the entrepreneur can't figure it out. It's getting the messaging right. It's asking the right questions. But and sometimes you luck out and you ask the right question or you message it right early, and sometimes that takes time. And so those early investors, when they look at a business that's been there for 2 months and they've already figured out a way to move forward, that's fine. If they've been there for 8 months and they've been capital efficient and they've just now figured out a way to move forward, that's also fine. The part where investors start to worry is if it's been that 8 to 12 months or 8 to 18 months and they haven't been capital efficient and they're just now maybe getting some answers about how to move forward. That starts to raise the question of, well, were you spending your time doing the right thing? Were you building too much product before going out and doing that customer discovery work? The customer discovery work should be low cost, should be fairly light in terms of the amount of other people you have to get involved, right? You don't have to pay someone to code something necessarily to go talk to a potential customer. And so that's where investors start to look like, okay, how efficient are you being? How much evidence is there really? And what plan do you have to move it to that next stage?
Yeah, all great things to focus on. It's not an easy road. Last question. What books, resources, podcasts do you tend to lean on, for your, daily, weekly, and monthly learning?
So books wise, I read lots of books, kind of all over the board. I just noticed actually today the third version of Brad Feld's Venture Deals came out. I would recommend that book.
Awesome.
If you're an investor, definitely, that book and Startup Wealth, are key books to read. If you're an entrepreneur, that book's a key book to read. Obviously Startup Wealth can be helpful, but also any of Steve Blank's books, just really on kind of the process of building a company are useful. And then kind of all the books that have somewhat been associated with his work or his progress, is a useful way to think about building a company. Other things, I'm a huge fan of Econ Talk as a podcast. I've been listening to that podcast since it started, since before podcasts were cool, I guess. But I don't listen to any others as regularly. I guess the other one that comes close, it actually is Masters in Business by Barry Ritholtz. That's the only other one I listen to maybe as frequently. The A16Z podcast, there's a lot of good stuff in there. The Origins podcast is pretty interesting. So I don't know, there's some good resources.
That's great. That's great. Josh, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Everyone, take a look, definitely, Startup Wealth, as well as How to Make Money Investing in Pre-IPO Stocks. Where can we find those?
If you go to my website, joshmoore.net, or the site for Startup Wealth, startupwealth.com. And of course, you can buy both of them in print or Kindle on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we'll post this. People are probably watching this now on Founders Live, and I will post some information on the books. And feel free to be on there as well and add value and answer questions, or be active.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. I'll see you soon.